While some AFL teams can go an entire season with only one loss, there are a select few that can go an entire season with only one win. West Coast have won 1 out of 19 games so far this season, and it's looking like that might be it. Their only win? A 19-point win over GWS at Optus Stadium, but you can't expect Jake Waterman to kick 4 goals every week. It's safe to say West Coast hasn't met expectations this season, which is tough considering they only won 2 games last year, avoiding the wooden spoon on percentage alone. But basing a team's performance on just games won just isn't a fair assessment. Maybe the opposing team had their best game of the year, but it's hard to argue that case when you've lost 4 games by over 100 points. You want to know how many other teams have lost a game by over 100? 0. West Coast haven't had just a bad season. They're breaking club records that have stood for decades, and not the good kind. West Coast's 171-point loss to Sydney in round 15 of this year was their biggest defeat ever. How can a club go from winning the premiership to the worst team in AFL history only 5 years later? The first troubling signs only began at the end of the 2021 season. It's hard to remember, but before West Coast finished 17th last year, they came 5th in 2019 and 2020, before dropping to 9th in 2021. You know what else happened in 2021? Willie Rioli gave the AFL a fake urine sample and was suspended for 2 years. And it's almost certain he did this because he had drugs in his system. West Coast drug culture began to get really bad around the time of their premiership win in 2006, after a player collapsed and nearly died outside a Las Vegas hotel in October of the same year, 1 month after the grand final. Of course, we all know about Ben Cousins' drug problem, which likely formed as a result of the club's drug culture. Club culture is very strong, and it takes many people standing up against what's wrong to change it. It's possible that West Coast drug culture has been passed on through generations and that it's hitting an all-time high. I can't give any other possible explanation as to how a team can lose by 171 points in today's game where matches are as close as ever. No team had scored 200 points in a decade, and Sydney accomplished it with ease against West Coast. Let's say West Coast doesn't have a drug problem. What could it be? The next thing you'd have to question is their leadership. Luke Shuey, the Eagles captain. After that loss against Sydney, Luke Shuey stated that responsibility rested solely on the players, and that senior Eagles are not pulling their weight. I watched Luke Shuey's press conference after the game, and he honestly seemed disappointed and looked like he cared about the club's success. Compare that to someone like Jack Darling, who was smiling after West Coast lost to Richmond, although he had just kicked his 500th goal, so I can cut him a bit of slack. It is possible that West Coast players only care about their individual success, but I just don't think that's true. The likely reality is that the players just don't care. Not tackling players, not running their guts out, and not spoiling the ball in defense. These are things that waffle players might get away with, but in the AFL it's an entirely different environment. That's why so many players struggle in their first game. Which leads me into the third possible reason. The team is just too inexperienced. Yeah, West Coast has some older, more experienced players like Luke Shuey, Shannon Hearn, and Jack Darling. But many of those players from the 2018 Premiership team have retired, and some of the ones that are still playing have really struggled this season. Andrew Gaff, Elliot Yeo, Dom Sheed. You can argue that West Coast is going through a rebuild, because that's exactly what they're doing. But if you're a West Coast fan, it's hard to see the light at the end of the tunnel. However, many younger players are showing promise. Oscar Allen kicks multiple goals every week, Bailey Williams takes many good marks, and Ruben Gimby got 19 disposals in West Coast's 171-point loss. For a rebuild, you have to be at the bottom of the ladder for at least a few years. Sydney did it in 2 years, while Adelaide did it in 3. And it's possible that it might never pay off and West Coast just stays at the bottom of the ladder with no reward waiting for them at the end. So you have to ask yourself, is it worth it to be the laughingstock of the AFL for several years for a shot at premiership glory?